When I was young, we had a tradition of going to my mom's parents every year. We'd see them during either Christmas or Thanksgiving, and then for a vacation during the summer, typically we'd go up and see them as well. I grew up in South Jersey, and they were up outside of Binghamton, New York, and so if it was Thanksgiving, we'd leave on a Wednesday afternoon after school and make the trip. Now, I have 3 brothers, and so we pack into the car and make that journey knowing at the end of the trip that we'd be at my grandparents' house and there would be food and family and a good long weekend. So we planned this so that everyone was in town. So whether it was Christmas or whether it was Thanksgiving, it was planned. So my aunts and uncles and their kids, my cousins, we'd all just show up for the celebration. And we'd spend days together, we'd play games, we'd eat good food, we'd do all those things, but it required us going on the trip from our house in Jersey up to New York. And there's an experience that lives in infamy in our family on one of those journeys. We had left the house, we were getting fairly close to being there in terms of the overall journey, and my youngest brother decides that he's hungry. And in his mind, he wasn't just hungry, he was about to starve. And so he asked one of the famous questions that children like to ask on journeys such as these: are we almost there yet? Because I'm hungry. Right, parents? We've heard this question millions of times. And we said, well, we're almost there. My parents responded, we'll get food when we get there, because there was never a lack of food at my grandparents'. And so we'll eat when we get there. It'll be okay. You'll make it. You'll survive. And he gets to the point where he decides that he's just really hungry. And it's not changing, and not stopping is not going to fix it. And so he cries in the car, we're never going to eat again. And my parents assured him, trust us, there is food, you will eat, you will survive, it will be okay. And time goes on, and we're a little bit further in the journey, and he's still not convinced. And so we pull up to a stoplight, and on the right-hand side of the car where he's sitting is a gas station. And in the window of the gas station is a rack full of chips and Doritos and Twinkies and good stuff like Tasty Cakes. And he looks at the rack in the window, not willing to wait for what's to come, and cries out, look at all that food! And we just kind of looked at him and said, Dan, that's nothing in comparison to what's coming. And yet in the story we find ourselves in Scripture this morning, we see a people who are hungry. We see Jesus reach out and meet that need in such a way that he gives them a picture of not just a meager meal that's coming, but of something far greater. And so if you'll turn with me to John chapter 6 this morning, I'll start reading in verse 1. And then we'll pray and see what God might have for us this morning. After this, Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. A huge crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was performing by healing the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. So when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, where will we buy bread so these people can eat? He asked this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? And Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also with the fish as much as they wanted. When they were full, he told the disciples, Collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." And so, verse 13, they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. And Father, you are merciful to us, and you give us far more than we possibly deserve. And so reveal yourself to us through your word this morning, that we might leave here differently than we came in. Amen. So this is one of the only miracles that's recorded in all 4 of the Gospels for us. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell us this story. And Jesus has been ministering to, the other Gospels tell us, caring for people, healing the sick, praying with, loving, and serving people, ministering to them all day long. And he's gotten to the end of the day, and he pulls his disciples in and says, "Let's go away for a bit so that we can get some rest." And Jesus has been giving of himself over and over and over again. So he says to the disciples, let's go over here, let's get a break, let's get some space to ourselves so that we can relax, so we can breathe for a bit. And so he pulls his disciples with him, and yet he turns and realizes that the crowd is flocking to him. They're not leaving him alone. Right? Most of us have been there. You've worked a long day at work. Maybe you've pulled a double shift. Maybe you've done more than you expected to. Maybe the kids you're teaching are more difficult this day than a normal day. Whatever it may be for you, maybe you've got to work with me, and that's just stressful enough. But you've got to get away at the end of the day, and you get to that point where before you go into the house to face everything else you know is coming, dinner's got to be made and things need to be cleaned, or maybe you're doing a project at the house and that needs to be completed, and you just need some space. And that's the point Jesus and the disciples find themselves at. And so for me, I'd pull up to the house and I'd just sit in the car and I'd count to 100, maybe 200, sometimes 1,000, just to get a space where I can breathe. And that's where Jesus is. So he pulls the disciples away and says, "Let's take a break, guys. Let's get away from the crowd that's pressing in on us all day. Get a break from serving, from giving of ourselves." And yet Jesus goes away, and it doesn't change. They follow him up onto the side of the mountain. And John tells us that Passover's near, and so it's likely that these people who are here have come in for Passover. They've come in for this massive celebration in Jerusalem. And so for some of them, this is probably the closest they get to seeing Jesus. They know, I've got this one moment, I'm going to take advantage of it. So wherever he goes for the next however long I've got, I'm going to follow him. I'm going to go after him. I'm going to be where he is so that he is able to minister to me, so I can hear from him and learn from him. And this massive crowd comes up. And it's late in the evening. It's time for dinner. And the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Jesus, we came here for a break. We wanted some space. We wanted some room. How about you just send the people away so they can go eat? How about you just send the people to go get some food, and that way we can get the break we came here for, and they can get the food that they need, and everything will be okay." And Jesus says, no, guys, that's not how it's going to work today. You feed them. He turns to Philip, and he says, "Where will we buy bread so these people can eat?" Philip, here's the question. Where do we get food to feed these people? Philip's the local guy, right? If you're going somewhere and you want to know where the good food is, you ask the local guy where the food is. Like if I'm going to Alabama, I'm asking Pastor Jeff, "Hey, where do I get the good barbecue?" And we can ask him that here too, because he knows where the good barbecue is. But he asks Philip, he says, "You're going to have the knowledge, you're going to know where we go, how we get the stuff, how we provide for all these people. Where do we go?" And Philip's response is, "Jesus, if we had 200 denarii," now it's about a day's wage is what a denarius is. He said, if we worked for 200 days, saved all of it, had it in a bank account, we could go out and we could get something, but it would be enough that everybody would get a crumb. It wouldn't be enough to satisfy. If we worked for 8 months and spent all of our 8 months of income on this one meal, we get something, but not enough. Now, how many of you have been hungry to a point where you go to a meal and maybe you're waiting and you get to the appetizer? And you get the appetizer and it just makes you hungrier, right? You eat that thing and you're like, okay, now I need the food because I'm hungry. Give me something. Philip says, we can't even give them an appetizer, Jesus, with what we've got. There's nothing that's going to satisfy them. There's nothing we can do. And Andrew comes onto the scene. He says, all right, Jesus, I've been out in the crowd, and all I've found is one boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus, just so you're aware, they're barley, so they're like the poor man's bread. Right? I'm not going to get some focaccia and dipping it in some olive oil and some spices and rubbing it around in there and eating the good stuff. It's the poor man's bread, and he's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And there are 5,000 men here. So we've got their wives and their children. Jesus, you just better send them away. There's nothing you can do that's going to fix this, is there? Understanding. There's nothing you can do that's going to make this better. We don't have money. And even if we did have money, Jesus, there's no Sam's Club down the street. There's no Costco. There's no BJ's. We're not walking into anywhere and saying, hey, we need bread for 5,000 men plus 3,000, 4,000 other people. Can we just get that in a cart and go? Right? They don't have that ability. Even if they had the resources to buy it, they don't have anywhere to go and get it. And so Jesus looks out at the crowd and instead of sending them away, says, bring me the loaves and fish. And then verse 10, Jesus says, have the people sit down. Now remember, they've come up onto the side of the mountain to do what? To get away, to get some rest, to escape from the people pressing in on them. The people have now pressed in on them. And Jesus' response to the disciples is, bring me the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then tell the people to sit down. Let them rest. Let them get a break. Let the weary people, the hungry people get a rest. I'm not done here yet. And there's plenty of grass. Verse 10 says, so the people sit down. The men numbered 5,000. Jesus took the loaves after giving thanks, and he distributed them to those who were seated. And Jesus, you can picture the scene, 5,000 people plus their families spread out in front of him, and they're hungry. And the disciples walk up to Jesus and say, all right, Jesus, here's 5 loaves and 2 fish. What now? And Jesus gives thanks. And you can almost see the disciples going, Jesus, what are you giving thanks for? 5,000 men plus wives and children, 5 loaves, 2 fish. What are you giving thanks for? And Jesus gives thanks and begins to take the bread and the fish and break it and tells the disciples, just start handing it out. And very quickly they realize this is not normal. Right? If we get done today and you go back to the table and Joy's running out of food, and all of a sudden she hands a sandwich to somebody and another one shows up, and she hands a sandwich to somebody else and another one shows up. We're thinking something weird's going on here. Jesus is multiplying the little lunch this boy had. This meager little meal that might have satisfied him is now feeding 5,000 men plus their families. And John tells us explicitly, so he also gave out the fish in the end of verse 11 as much as they wanted. What was Philip's response? Jesus says, Philip, where do we get food to feed these people? And he says, if we had 8 months of money and spent it all on this meal, we'd get enough to give them a crumb. And Jesus takes a poor man's lunch and begins to break it to the point where they had all that they wanted. And then verse 12, when they were full, he told his disciples, collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. 5 loaves and 2 fish, and there's leftovers. Not only are there leftovers, but they filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. He fed everyone, and the disciples are going around collecting baskets full of the leftovers. And Jesus took what Philip said, we don't even have enough if we pulled all of our resources to give him an appetizer, and created a full meal. They're at the point, like we've been there at the buffet, right? And you're eating and you've filled yourself up and you think, man, I really want another helping of ice cream if you're like me. Like I want to go back and get more ice cream with some whipped cream and some cherries on top and the chocolate syrup and the caramel and, right? You with me? But you're sitting at the table and you're going, if I do that, I'm going to regret it later. They're at that point where it's like, okay, I've eaten all that I want, all that I could possibly imagine, and there's more, but I can't possibly touch it. And Jesus sends the disciples out. There's that much excess. And Jesus says, go collect it so that we don't waste anything. The disciples begin to realize just what Jesus has done. They looked at Jesus early on and said, there's nothing we can do here that's going to fix this problem. And Jesus says, have you forgotten who I am? We'd like to think, right? Disciples had been with Jesus at this point long enough to see him heal sick people, long enough to see him raise men, women, children who can't walk up and say, just take your mat and go. They've seen all these miracles, and they look out at this crowd, and they can't possibly fathom what could Jesus do in this circumstance with a tiny little meal that could possibly be of value here. We might as well just send the people home. And oftentimes, we look at ourselves, and we say, if we're honest, God, what can you do with this? There's not much here to work with. I mean, yeah, your word tells me that you've given me gifts and talents and abilities, that you've put me in a body that I can be a part of, that I can serve in and be involved in. But God, really, what can you do with this? So there are some people who serve out of pride, right? If I can get in a place where people see me, if I can get on the platform, if I can record a video, if I can fill in the blank with where I can serve and people can see me, then I look important. And some people serve God out of pride. But let's be honest, some of us don't serve God out of pride. Because I'm not quite good enough. Or God couldn't possibly use what I bring to the table. And here God takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeds 5,000 people. He can use what you bring to the table. He can use the gifts and talents that he has in his wisdom given to you. And you specifically. So that you could serve him in a way that brings him glory. So we don't serve in our own strength. Paul specifically tells the people he's writing to, we don't serve in our strength. We serve in the strength that God provides us. Because if we serve in our strength, then we can serve with pride so that I get the attention, I get the glory, I get the eyes on me. But if I serve out of the strength that God gives me, the gifts God has given me, the blessings God has given me, he's the one who gets the glory. He's the one who gets the attention. And yet our tendency is to say, well, I'm not quite there. Does that mean we shouldn't work to strengthen the things he's given us? Does it mean we shouldn't work to encourage and strengthen and help one another so that we can do better or use the gifts he's given to us more effectively? Absolutely. But that means we don't have the excuse to say, well, God just can't use what I've got. God just can't use the things that he's given to me in such a way to make a difference, to make an impact. God has put you here in this place. He's put you in the places that he has sent you, whether it's in your job or in your neighborhood or the regular run of your life. that you can use the talents, the abilities, the wisdom he's given to you to make much of him. Right? We don't just gather to sing songs like How Great Thou Art, but he sends us out that we might encourage one another, that we declare that message, not just with our mouths, but in our lives, that we declare his greatness, his goodness, not our own. See, my brother couldn't get his mind around the meal that waited for him when we got to my grandparents'. He couldn't wait for that point. All he saw was the gas station window and decided, if I just gorge myself on that, I'll be happy. Like, look at all that food right there. He couldn't imagine that there was a time coming where his hunger would be better filled than with the junk food in the window. And so Jesus says to the disciples, simply bring me what you have. And he says to us this morning, simply bring me what you have, that I might make much out of it. But Jesus didn't just tell the disciples, bring me. He also gave himself. So we don't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And Jesus became bread broken for us, as he gave his own body that he might serve us. The King who created the world, spoke it into existence, holds it in the palm of his hand, humbled himself that he might be broken, gave himself that we might have life. He doesn't call us to serve because he needs it. He doesn't call us to give of ourselves because if we don't, then he's lost it. He's out of control. He calls us to give that we might receive joy. You can imagine the faces on the disciples when they realize 5 loaves, 2 fish, now we've got 12 baskets left over. That's amazing. He doesn't call us to give of ourselves that we might be satisfied, but ultimately that he might display his glory. Paul, talking to the Corinthians, says, I've got this weakness in me, this thorn in my flesh, he calls it, that I've prayed and begged God, please take this away. If you just take this away, I can serve you better. If you just take this away, I can do more for you. And God's repeated answer to him is, no. Just hang in there. In 2 Corinthians 12, verse 8, he says, concerning this thorn, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness. And so Paul's response to God's statement to him, my power is made perfect when you are weak, is, therefore I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. When I don't know where to turn, when I don't have enough to give, when I acknowledge my weakness, then Christ's power is made evident in me. Christ's glory is made evident in me. See, when I can do it on my own, I don't need him. When my skills or my talents can get me where I want to be, I don't need Jesus. And the disciples get to a point in our story this morning and say, Jesus, there's nothing we can do. There's not a way we can go. There's not an amount we can pay. There's not a place we can go to get it. We've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And what happens? Jesus shows up in that moment and does far more than they could possibly imagine. And you can imagine the disciples going, we didn't see that coming. Didn't think that was going to happen. And all 4 of the writers of the Gospels record the story for us. John says, these things are written that we might know that Jesus is the Messiah, the one who's come from God to save us, and that by believing in him we might have life. And this story sticks in the mind of the disciples and is inspired by the Spirit of God to be included for us, that we might see the glory of God in the midst of our lack. When I was in high school, we got to pick some of the classes, and I hated and still, if I'm honest with you, don't like public speaking. And yet I signed up for the class because I don't know why. Because I don't like myself sometimes, apparently. I'm not sure. But I signed up for the class, and I made it through. But it's still not my favorite thing. And yet God says, John, if you'll just give me what you've got, I can use that. And to this day, I can't tell you how I stand up here and talk to people. But God simply said, if you'll just give me what you have, if you're faithful in what you have, I can use that. And God, if you're faithful to give him what you have, as meager as you may think it is able to use that to do far more than you could possibly imagine. Peter says his divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of him who called us. By his glory and goodness, he's given us everything we need. And so if you're struggling this morning to think through, what can God do with me? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John all remind us he can do far more than you think with far less than you think. And so my encouragement, simply offer yourself to him. Simply offer yourself to him and say, God, I don't know what I have that you can use, but whatever I've got, it's yours. Whatever I've got, you are able to use it to do far more than I think. Let's love and serve and encourage one another to give of ourselves, that God would get the glory, and that we might get the resulting joy that comes from it.